The Great Emu War is one of the strangest events in Australian history, and many people around the world are surprised to learn that it really happened. Even though the name sounds like a joke, it refers to a real operation carried out by the Australian government in 1932. It was not a war between countries or armies. Instead, it was a conflict between people and a population of large, fast-running birds called emus. These birds were not trying to start trouble on purpose, but their natural behavior created serious problems for farmers who depended on their crops to survive. The story has become famous because the soldiers who were sent to help the farmers struggled to deal with the emus, and in the end, the birds seemed to win. This unusual situation has made the Great Emu War a humorous but also meaningful part of Australian history. To understand why this event happened, it is important to look at what life was like in Australia during the early 1930s. The world was going through the Great Depression, a period when many people lost their jobs and had little money. In Australia, the government encouraged farmers to grow more wheat to help the economy. Many soldiers who had fought in World War I were also given land to farm when they returned home. These men hoped to build a new life through agriculture, but they faced many problems. One major issue was the weather. Western Australia often experienced droughts, which made farming difficult. Another issue was the unstable price of wheat. Farmers were promised financial support from the government, but that support was slow to arrive. As a result, many farmers had very little income but still had to maintain their land and feed their families. A third and unexpected problem came from nature. Every year, large groups of emus migrate across different parts of Australia in search of food and water. Emus are tall, flightless birds with long legs and strong bodies. They can run very fast, up to 50 kilometers per hour, and they travel in groups that can number in the hundreds or thousands. In 1932, an especially large number of emus moved into the farming areas of Western Australia. These birds were drawn to the wheat fields, which provided an easy source of food. The emus also found the farm's water sources useful, especially during dry periods. For the farmers, this was a disaster. The emus trampled fences, ate crops, and damaged the ground. Each bird could ruin a surprising amount of farmland simply by moving through it. The farmers were already struggling, and the emus made the situation much worse. The farmers asked the government for help, and the government tried to take their concerns seriously. At the time, there was a belief that military equipment and expertise could solve the problem. The Minister of Defense, Sir George Pearce, agreed to send a small team of soldiers to the farming region. These soldiers were equipped with machine guns and ammunition. The idea was that the soldiers would help reduce the number of emus, which would protect the wheat fields and give the farmers some relief. The government probably did not expect the mission to become famous. It was simply meant to be a practical solution to an agricultural problem. But the moment soldiers with machine guns were sent out to deal with birds, the situation already had the ingredients of a strange and memorable story. The operation began in November 1932. The soldiers quickly learned that dealing with emus was not as easy as it sounded on paper. Emus are very fast, very strong, and surprisingly smart when they sense danger. When the soldiers tried to approach a group of emus, the birds often scattered in many different directions. This made it almost impossible to fire at them effectively. The machine guns required the birds to be close together, but the emus rarely stayed grouped once humans appeared. On the first day of action, the soldiers fired their guns, but the birds ran in unpredictable patterns, and very few were actually hit. The soldiers realized they were dealing with a type of enemy unlike any they had ever faced. Another problem was the terrain. The farming lands were rough, uneven, and covered with bushes. Machine guns work best in clear, open areas, but the emus moved through thick vegetation where visibility was low. Many times, by the time a soldier could aim the gun, the birds had already disappeared into the brush. On one occasion, the soldiers attempted to mount a machine gun on a truck to chase the emus. However, the ground was too bumpy, making the aim completely inaccurate. The truck driver also struggled to match the birds' quick movements. In the end, the moving truck experiment failed and even created danger for the soldiers themselves. The emus also showed surprising toughness. Farmers and soldiers both noted that the birds could survive injuries that would have disabled other animals. There were reports of emus being hit by bullets and still running for long distances before collapsing. Some even seemed to survive their wounds entirely. This gave the impression that the emus were almost invincible, which added to the humorous legend that grew around the incident. Of course, the birds were not truly invincible. They were simply strong, lean, and well adapted to the environment. But from the soldiers' point of view, it seemed as if the birds were defeating modern weapons with their natural abilities. As the days passed, the media began to report on the situation. Newspapers described the event in dramatic and sometimes humorous ways. Journalists joked about the emus as if they were trained military opponents who knew how to avoid gunfire and break into scattered tactical units. Some articles even described the emus as using guerrilla warfare strategies. This storytelling made the event even more entertaining to the public. At a time when people needed relief from the stress of the global economic crisis, the idea of soldiers struggling to outsmart birds provided comic relief. However, for the farmers, the damage was no laughing matter. Their livelihoods were at risk, and the operation was not producing the results they needed. After several weeks, the government realized that the mission was ineffective. The soldiers had fired many rounds of ammunition but had eliminated far fewer birds than expected. The cost of the operation was becoming difficult to justify, and public opinion was mixed. Some people considered the mission a waste of resources. Others found it amusing but did not believe it was accomplishing its main purpose. Eventually, the military operation was stopped. The soldiers withdrew, and the farmers were left to find other ways to deal with the emu problem. The end of the Great Emu War did not mean the end of the emu issue. Farmers still needed to protect their crops, so the government later introduced a bounty system. Under this system, farmers could receive payment for each emu they killed. This approach turned out to be more practical than using soldiers and machine guns. Farmers could respond quickly to birds near their own land, and the bounty encouraged them to take direct action. In addition to the bounty system, better fencing was developed. These fences made it harder for emus to enter farmland, which reduced the need for hunting. Over time, these more practical strategies proved successful. The number of emus in the farming areas decreased, and the damage to crops became more manageable. The Great Emu War eventually faded from everyday memory, but it later returned as a piece of humorous historical trivia. People enjoy telling the story because it seems so unlikely. The idea that one of the world's most advanced militaries struggled against a bird brings a smile to many faces. At the same time, the event offers some lessons. It shows that nature does not always cooperate with human plans. It also reminds us that using large-scale military force is not always the best way to solve environmental or agricultural problems. Sometimes a simpler, local, or more flexible solution works better. Today, the Great Emu War is often mentioned in podcasts, documentaries, and online discussions. Many people learn about it for the first time and assume it is fictional. But the event is very real, and the reports from 1932 prove that soldiers truly were sent to deal with the birds. The funny nickname Great Emu War was added later, but it has become part of how people remember the story. Modern Australians often treat the incident as part of their quirky national identity. It shows the country's ability to laugh at itself and to turn even failures into entertaining stories. Although the event is widely laughed at, it is also important to remember the difficult circumstances behind it. The farmers in Western Australia were not trying to cause chaos or create a strange historical moment. They were struggling to survive during a harsh economic period, and the emus posed a serious threat to their livelihood. For them, the arrival of the emus was not funny, but stressful and frightening. The soldiers, too, were doing their best with the tools they had, even though the situation turned out to be very challenging. When we look back at the Great Emu War, it can be both humorous and respectful. It is humorous because of how odd the situation was, and respectful because real people were doing their best in a hard time. In simple terms, the Great Emu War shows what happens when nature and human plans collide in unexpected ways. It also proves that modern technology does not always guarantee success. The emus did not win because they had better weapons. They won because they were simply well adapted to their environment. They knew how to run, hide, scatter, and survive in a landscape they understood deeply. The soldiers, on the other hand, were trying to apply military methods to a problem that required different thinking. In the end, the Great Emu War remains one of history's most unusual stories. It teaches lessons about humility, adaptation, and the limits of human control over nature. It is both a serious event because real economic damage occurred and a funny one because of how the operation unfolded. Whether viewed as a failure, a comedy, or a learning experience, it continues to capture people's imagination around the world.